Welcome to the Woven Energy Podcast on Real Practical Shamanism with me, Joseph Sikora, and as always, Damon Smith. And we are here to talk about shamanism from the ground up. Now, for this episode, we want to take a sidestep from our energy change episodes, our main level 4 technique episodes, and perhaps mix one in that's a little bit more general interest. And Damon, I believe you've got a really interesting topic to talk about. Which our preliminary title is The Language of Trees.
Yeah, so, as with everything, mate, coming up with a title is the hardest thing, right?
Well, if I call the episode The Language of Trees, I think we might sort of branch out into a new type of audience, the type of...
I don't know. I mean, it sounds like it's going to be very hippy-dippy, doesn't it? But it remains to be seen whether it actually is hippy-dippy or not.
This is what I like about our teachings, especially back in the old days when we did all this together rather than just talked on a podcast about it. But it would always seem like it would be hippy-dippy, and then there'd be an underpinning of reality and practicality to it, which is kind of what drew me to all of this stuff in the first place anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah, excited. Do we have any Patreons to thank?
We do, mate. I mean, the thing is that Patreon, in their wisdom, have the normal way that I scan back who we have to thank. Patreon, in their wisdom, have changed it, and now I can't find anything. But basically, what I do know is we've got a new patron called Mark Walker, and we've got another new patron who Patreon won't tell me their name. So, okay, they've been changing the user interface, and I wasn't that great with it to start off with. And I'm even less great with it now. I'm just wondering if there's some way we can... It's just awful. Why can't they just leave it alone? Just when I got used to it, But...
it's like in the supermarkets when they change everything around for no apparent reason. You go in and you can't find anything.
Yeah, exactly.
This is what they do.
Exactly. So here's the thing, what we're going to do, right? We're just going to thank all of our wonderful 62 patrons. You guys are amazing. Every single one of you. I do know a whole bunch of your names. I've met a substantial number of you now. And you keep this thing going. And so here's a nice mainstream Woven Energy shamanism episode dedicated to the patrons. How about that? There you go.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So, I've heard and read about... There's a common, with trees, we know that they communicate with each other via their roots and via the underground networks. Right. So that would be super interesting for me, but I'm more than happy for you to just take it away, Damon. This is your idea, so I'd love to know more about the language of trees.
The underground networks, mycelial networks and all that kind of stuff, we'll get onto that on another one. I want to talk about the above ground communication of trees and how they communicate with each other, with the environment, with the sky, and with shamans who are practicing their technique underneath those trees. I mean, one of the things that I was discussing recently was the relative health that I've enjoyed in my life, considering how absolutely appallingly bad my lifestyle is. I get nowhere near enough sleep. My diet is about as bad as a diet can get. And it's and I work a ridiculous amount of time, work long hours, and I should be in a really bad way. But actually, somehow I seem to have done all right to this point in time. Touch wood. And also I don't have very many wrinkles. I can't remember my age. I'm 50 middles somewhere. I'm 57. My birthday coming up. I don't know.
I have to think about my age. You get to a certain age and you just go, I just can't. And I have to work it out here.
And I don't really have any wrinkles to speak of, or anything like that. Now these things are partly genetic, and there's lots of different factors that you take into account in these things. So my beard has definitely gone grey, which hasn't hurt my consulting work any. It's going grey anyway. But in terms of
more distinguished
health, yeah, exactly. Nobody listens to anybody who hasn't got a grey beard, right? So, But in terms of health, and I was trying to think why this might be. First of all, it could be genetic, right? It could be a range of different things. But one of the things that occurred to me is because of my shamanistic practice over many years, I have spent an awful long time among the trees, in the woods. And those that have been out with me, I know several of the patrons have been out with me on various different events and jaunts and exciting adventures. At least I would hope they were exciting and not terrifying. They will know that I don't just sort of find a really flat, open grove with not much stuff in it and then do my spirit dance in there. I like to get in among the bushes, in among the brambles, in among the trees. And to a certain extent, I'm covered in what might be called, I've spent a large part of my life covered in what might be called the language of the trees, because trees use chemical communication above ground. And rather than, like we would use speech, and we also use written communication, trees use chemical communication. And I think, as I've said many times on many different episodes, there is nowhere better for practicing shamanistic technique than mixed deciduous woodland. But also, pine forests, forests further north can also be great because pine trees especially seem to shout in terms of tree language. They give off an awful lot of what might be called tree words. And so let's talk about what these words are. Now, first of all, I
imagine it's more complex than smell to us. Or
well,
would we perceive
smell.
it as smell?
It includes smell, but no, not necessarily, because some of these words have effects on us, but they don't smell of anything. So some of them certainly do have usually very pleasant smell. And we've talked about them before in different contexts. I did talk about them on the introductory lecture to the Gathering of the Tribe, I think this year, or it might have been another year. A similar sort of lecture that I did, where trees release compounds that are collectively known as terpenes, terpenes, into the atmosphere. In biological terms, often as what people call forest aerosols, which sounds weird, doesn't it? Sounds like some kid going around painting things in the forest, but they are incredibly complex. There are a series of related but quite diverse chemicals. In organic chemistry, they draw these things. I mean, you can do a search on it in Google Images and just type in terpenes and you'll see what I mean. When they write organic chemistry, because there's so much carbon involved, they don't actually write what the atoms are. They just draw lines between them and they make sort of hexagons and squiggly lines and all different shapes like that. And if you do a search on Google Images on terpenes, when you see a chart of the different kinds of molecules that you get, obviously organic molecules in this language of the forest, if you like, they look just like Egyptian hieroglyphics. They are very, very similar looking thing to the way that we have written down sort of symbol words in the past, or Chinese characters or something like that. And of course, these things are emitted in lots of different varieties and ways and for different purposes. They are generated by a lot of different natural processes in vegetation in general, but particularly by trees. And obviously trees are quite big, right? And at one time, trees covered an awful lot of this planet. That's been changing for the worse over a long period of time, but they did at one time. And they come out of leaves and other parts of the plant. The biogenic processes that cause the emission of these things create a kind of atmosphere or underlying context, energy context to forests. And they are obviously mixed in with other complexities like fungal spores, pollen, stuff like that. And also, you get stuff that's been given off from forest fires and all that kind of stuff, and all gets kind of mixed together in an incredibly complex mix. in the atmosphere, when you're in there, when you're in the forest, when you're practicing your spirit dance, or just going for, as I do a lot, just going for a shamanic walk, as you guys all know by now. A shamanic walk is one where you don't decide where you're going. And you allow the forest to decide where you're going, which is a great thing to do. Just about every lunchtime I do a short shamanic walk. That's one of the blessings of where I live, why I moved here. So, but underlying all of this are these terpenes that the trees give off. And they kind of have the biggest effect. One of the effects they have is they can, at the tree's direction, they can, as I describe it, talk to clouds. So there's some clouds coming over. The trees decide they want some water, so they release the kind of terpenes that water droplets adhere to. Those terpenes rise up into the clouds. The water vapor in the clouds coalesces around the terpene molecules, forming little droplets that form rain. And so,
wow,
to a certain extent,
that?
Yeah, this is absolutely true. So the trees can tell the clouds to a certain extent when they want it to rain by using terpenes as messengers. So this is why, one of the reasons why I call it the language of the clouds. The trees talk to the clouds using terpenes as their characters, as their hieroglyphics, if you like, and they send a message saying, "Please give me some rain."
That's been scientifically proven.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing. Is that why it rains so much over like the Amazon and stuff?
Absolutely. One of the reasons. There's lots of reasons, yeah. And that's the whole thing with shamanism. This thing is all, and it's the downer on, even subjects like biology in academia, is shamanism doesn't try to reduce complexity. We deal with that. So in academia, when we say this has been scientifically proven, sure, they do experiments to see if, for instance, water droplets will adhere to these things, and they check out the properties of these molecules. And that's sort of what I'm working on at the moment in my career. One of my two major customers is heavily involved in not these chemicals, but other chemicals. So in a kind of related sense, a holistic sense of looking at chemicals, lots of different kind of chemicals, but in it through a sort of holistic lens. That's what shamans do. But of course, shamans don't know about the molecular structure of your camphor and stuff like that. They know that there is a language of the trees, and just like the clouds understand that language. When I say understand, I mean like understand in a Gaian sense. If you think of the whole world as one single organism, and all of the trees and the lakes and the forests and the rivers, you can think of the rivers. This is like the ancient legend of Panku in Chinese mythology. The rivers were his blood, and I forget which the different bits were. And the sun and the moon were his eyes, and all this kind of stuff. The universe, to a certain extent, is the body of the underlying spirit of nature, in a metaphoric sense, and shamans tend to approach that in the way of, let's take the holistic approach. This is what Chalicity is all about. This is what Amska is all about. This is what level 3, level 4, this is what the level 4 changes that we've been talking about. That's a familiarization, right? Level 1, 2, 3 enables you to build that kind of radar for nature, in which you're dealing in complex energy changes, but you're also perceiving it in a lightweight level to learn from nature, putting yourself in a place where nature's teaching you directly. And so one of the ways to think about it is this language of trees. You can go out there into the forest and you can, if you like, bathe, if like taking a bath, you can bathe in the language of trees. And that's how I perceive it when I'm out in the woods, understanding the language. It's almost like that language has a strong activity upon us. If you're in a state of Chalicity, it's not difficult. And you find that it's not, this is one of the reasons, again, why I say forests are really good for shamanic practice, because it's bleeding obvious in the forest. There's so much of it. It's the forests are tree language central. Obviously, they're full of trees, right? So, but the trees do give off a lot of this kind of stuff, and the sense is not so much you're hearing the language with your ears, but more like you're bathing in it. If you remember, we mentioned some of the Rosicrucian imagery, and the imagery of the Hermetic tradition. And works like the Voynich manuscript. This would be on the Heretics podcast. There are a lot of images of maidens bathing in pools in that kind of imagery. You see images like that, and that's what this is all about. It's about bathing within the language that nature is teaching you with. Nature can teach you in lots of different ways. It can teach you in simplistic physical ways, which it does when you're doing your spirit dance or when you're doing climbing trees or whatever it is you're doing. But it can also teach you in more complex ways using this language that's sophisticated in the same way that human language is sophisticated. And so one of the things that's happened historically is that you can, people have found again and again, almost like a rediscovery of this aspect of shamanism, that you can bathe in forests. And it doesn't mean you wait for the rain to come and then there's puddles and you bathe in those puddles. It's that complex cloud of terpenes and other things that you're constantly bathed in. You can pick up on so much stuff from that, taking in the atmosphere of the forest. In Japan, this is called Shinrin Yoku. And basically it means, and I've said it many times, remember when we're talking about just where would you go and practice Chalisti? Well, one place is just to go and sit under a tree or go somewhere where there's no human beings. One of the reasons why that solitary practice, that we've often, though we have done, we've often criticized people who teach shamanism and say, hey, let's all go off in a group, which you have to do sometimes for some things. But the group, because we're human beings and because we got mirror neurons and all kinds of stuff going on in our brains, and because we're social animals, the noise of the group is going to swamp out the Shinrin Yoku in the forest. And this is why it's so much better to go by yourself, and practice your Chalisti, your Amskar, your level 3, your level 4, or beyond, in the forest, under the trees. And when you're doing your level 3 stuff, get in under those trees, get into the underbrush.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, where I live, just literally 30 seconds away, is a woodland. It's not a forest, but it's definitely a nice area. And one of my favorite places to go is to just sit in the woodland. And I would just practice Chalicity in there. And it makes sense. It's like, you don't really think about why you're drawn to places like that. I mean, it is nice being in the woods and everything, but maybe there's something more to it. But I definitely do remember that was a favorite spot of mine. I would find a log, sit there and practice that. The earth breathing stuff that you taught us a long time ago.
Yeah. I think there is something in it. I think there is something in why human beings like it. And it's this idea of co-evolution. If you think of the earth as a single organism, that organism is evolving as well as all of the sub-organisms that go and physical processes that go to make that up. We have evolved in parallel with trees. We've spent an awful long time in them. If you look at the sort of archaeological record, the paleontological record, we spent an awful long time in trees. And the language of trees is important to us because it can tell us things. It can tell us when the weather's going to change, If you're good enough at this stuff, when the trees are requesting rain from the clouds, So this is one of the things that shamans have been.
Do you think that taps into one of the core fundamentals of shamanism, which is where the shaman would understand the weather patterns to make sure that he would move the tribe to the places that best suit their survival? And so that's a part of it.
Exactly. And also, from the trees, from listening to the language of the trees, for instance, is this a place in decline? Spiritually speaking, in terms of the energy of the place, or is this a place on the up? Yeah. So this talking about global holistic climate change, Should we be moving on, or is it okay to stay here? All this stuff is already there encoded in the language of the trees. And so
I wonder what they'd be saying right now if they could really talk, those trees.
Yeah. And so,
I think
they can really
a good
talk.
shouting.
That's the point.
A good shouting.
Really, like, in terms of our behavior, that's a thing, but they're probably not thinking about it, because we're so mightily unimportant to them. You never know. But the natural human reaction to this language of the trees is to seek reasons why it happens on the micro scale. So, for instance, one of the reasons, plants, trees put an awful lot of energy into releasing this stuff in the atmosphere. And that doesn't make much sense. If it's not doing the tree any good, that doesn't make much sense in evolutionary terms. Why they're putting so much energy into it?
But because your objective is to conserve energy, isn't it?
Yes. But actually, if you look at that in a simplistic way, it doesn't make sense. But if you look at it in a holistic way, the trees as a whole are part of a forest as a whole, which is part of a greater ecology on the planet as a whole. It's in the interests of every part of that ecology to keep that ecology perpetuated, to keep it going. And in some ways, the different organisms within that have to communicate with each other in order to maintain the holistic, the Gaian organism, as it was described by one shaman, the shape of all shapes as they move together as one being. And this simplistic way of understanding evolution as the survival of the fittest, the nature is red in tooth and claw. It's the organism that treads on the heads of others successfully that survives. There's another end to that scale, which is, especially for us and for trees, we're social animals and they're social plants. This is why you get forests. It's in our interests as a whole for the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts, for messaging to occur. For, the simplistic example of that would be pollination, right? So, but when you look at it in simplistic terms, as it happened early on with the scientific investigation of this stuff, they thought that terpenes were probably a mechanism against herbivores, so to make the trees not that nice to eat for deer and stuff like that. But if you think of that, is that an explanation for why trees pour loads of effort into pouring out chemicals that smell really nice? I don't think, it doesn't make any sense, And so the more holistic view is the one that supports an evolutionary use of this language of the trees in a Gaian kind of context. I hope you understand what I mean by Gaia. The Gaia is a kind of hypothesis that the whole Earth is a single organism and that all the other organisms and physical processes on the Earth are interconnected in a way that they all mutually support each other and support the overall evolution of that single organism as a whole. And so, but obviously in more recent times, people have come to understand that again and again throughout human history, first with the shamans, all shamans, a lot of animists, but then in more modern times, so for instance, in Germany, there was a guy called Sebastian Kneip, Kneipp, who was a priest who came up with a sort of therapy method that involved bathing in the forest, bathing in the forest atmosphere. And then, the Japanese government picked up on this thing in the 1980s and was encouraging people to go in, same thing, get in among the forest, take in the atmosphere. It's good for health. And people again and again have noticed that people like to do this, but are they just imagining it? Is it just part of the whole shamanism imagination thing, or is there more to it than that? Well, fortunately, in very recent years, people in scientific institutions, it doesn't matter for shamanism, right? But people in scientific institutions have started to take this stuff seriously, and they've started looking into these terpenes and what they actually do. So just to give you an idea, I mean, there are literally thousands of these things. So this language, if you think about Chinese with all those thousands of characters, like old school Chinese, the language of the trees, the language of these terpenes and other chemicals and things that go to make up this complex forest atmosphere is as complicated as ancient Chinese with all those wonderful myriad characters in it and the way that the things get put together in different proportions and all that kind of stuff. So let's take a few out. Delta limonene is one of these terpenes, and that has been shown in the scientific literature to reduce allergic lung inflammation. So, some people are allergic to different things. If they get them in their lungs, it can cause a lot of inflammation. And it's been demonstrated in the lab that delta limonene will reduce allergic lung inflammation. And that whole thing with inflammation seems to be a problem in our society in general. A lot of cancers grow out of inflammation. And our lifestyle and diets and all of the ways that we live in our civilized, settled society tends, I think, to cause more things like inflammation of the and not just of the lungs, but in general, and things like emphysema. It tends to cause those sort of things. And there's another one called beta-thiamine, which has also been shown to reduce lung emphysema and inflammation. So basically, the intuition that this stuff has a generally calming effect on the spirit. The language of the tree speaks to you gently, and it speaks to you in a way that calms your spirit. And there's another reason why I go and tell people to go and sit under a tree to practice that chillicity. The language of the trees will play upon you while you're practicing your chillicity and help you achieve that state of chillicity through its general calming effect. And it may be those chemicals. It may be delta limonene and beta-thiamine and those sort of chemicals that are literally doing that to you. There is quite a famous one called gamma-terpenine, which is quite a confusing thing because they're terpenes, right? It's called gamma-terpenine, which is found in a lot of those sort of plants that have historically been used medicinally in various ways, again, to reduce different kinds of inflammatory responses. For instance, when you have a cold, you find this stuff in eucalyptus. Yeah, and that smell that comes off when you smell eucalyptus oil? That's the stuff. It's this gamma-terpenine. Another one of these terpenes that's doing that. And there's another one called borneol that does same kind of thing. But these are some of these are almost like classes of terpenes rather than.
And these have all been detected.
Yeah, these are all been detected. I'm reeling off ones that have actually been tested in the scientific literature. So these are the ones that I'm calling out at the moment. There's loads of them being detected, and because this is such a recent thing that people have taken an interest in this. Until recent years, there was a sort of bar humbug attitude towards all this stuff. Trees can't have a language, that kind of thing.
Well, scientists are in danger of becoming a little bit self-important, aren't they?
But my point is that in recent years, I think there's been a trend the other way, and there does seem to be an awful lot of literature, scientific literature in recent years that has looked into this stuff. There's still way more because of it was not a quote unquote not a proper subject of study in previous years. There's an awful lot of this stuff that hasn't been. I mean, there's thousands of these things, so there's going to be loads of this stuff that hasn't been investigated. But just in terms of what has been investigated, there's quite a lot. So for instance, in terms of tumors, anti-tumor effects of pinene, another terpene, are pretty well established in the scientific literature now, acting on things like lymphocytes and tumor cells. They have been shown to have anti-metastatic effects, especially alpha pinene. So basically, what that means is that they reduce the propensity of cancer cells to run away. That's part of that sort of metastasis. metastatic. They say the cancer metastasize. You get
Yeah.
this runaway growth of cancer, and that's what often leads to kind of terminal cancer, where people my age have probably got endless cancer cells in their body, but the tendency for them to run away, metastasize. They've shown again in the lab that the pinene which are terpenes, have had a effect that reduces the propensity for that to happen. For instance, beta pinene. And there's also ones that have shown to be able to kill or have a toxic effect against tumor cells. So, for instance, beta-thiamine, that's been suggested. Again, loads more research needs to be done. There are, and these the ones I've investigated tend to be the simpler terpenes, because obviously they're simpler chemicals, are easier to, and relatively, biochemistry is a complicated subject. Some of these hydrocarbon molecules, for instance, are horrifically complicated. Some of the simpler terpenes tend to have been the ones that have been investigated, but there's been a start on studies of more complex terpenes, more complex parts of the language, if you like. I think if you think in terms of analyzing a human language, you might say that the state that they're at in scientific terms is they've started analyzing some of the nouns. But now
like a 2 or 3 year old.
Yeah, exactly.
Like a 3-year-old would speak.
Elephant, giraffe, that kind of stuff. But the more complex terpenes, you could compare those to verbs and verb conjugation and all that kind of stuff. They have more. What's the simple ones often called the monoterpenes, but the terpenes with, like I said, more complex structures, like the sesquiterpenoids. Gosh, they take some pronunciation even in English, these things. Sesquiterpenes, basically. And they've also, in some studies, have shown sort of anti-cancer capabilities as well. But again, the stuff's so complicated. The thing is, who knows what people will be able to do with this stuff?
How have they done this? Have they sort of bottled up the terpene and given it as medicine, or
the poor mice? The poor mice, mate. You know how these guys operate, don't you? They start with mice.
I'm just thinking, okay, so
and then they move on to the cuter animals.
I'm just curious how they take a chemical excreted from trees, and turn that into some sort of medicine.
Well, they can give it lots of different. They don't have to turn it into a medicine. They just give the chemical. They isolate the chemical, and then they give the chemical directly to the animal. They could give it in the feed. They can inject it, all that kind of stuff. But there's not really anything. The way that these sort of studies they have to be done. The way that the laws of developed nations have been built. When you're doing biological studies, you can't just start with humans. They always start with the poor mice, right? And then they move on. They used to move on to, I don't know, monkeys and stuff. I don't know if they still do that. It's all very unpleasant. But the mice and monkeys have no say in the matter. So that's the kind of thing. But the point is that shamans of the past didn't do that. They weren't reprehensible. I mean, I'm sure some of them died trying this stuff, but they didn't do that. Shamans did their own experimentation, always have done. They did it on themselves, not on other people, or on other creatures, And that's the great thing about being a shaman. But it does make being a shaman a bit dangerous. It can do, Imagine trying out all those different mushrooms to find the ones that do stuff, that kind of stuff, and some of them kill you, But the point is that these things are a language. And some of the very recent studies have started to show that this is actually true. Just
a quick one. Sorry, just a quick one. I've just a quick thought, because I remember I watched an interview with our friend Doug, who got capsized at sea, and he was saying in this interview,
hey, Doug.
He was saying in this interview that when you're put into that situation as a human being, there is something that you just there's innate within us that just comes out, and you just know. So like they were debating about drinking turtle blood, and that's essentially what they managed to survive on. But there was something that told them that they could do that.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's like when you put into that extreme situation where you have to totally rely on something that's just hardwired into our brains. Perhaps that's what the shaman is tapping into.
Yeah, and I've said that. I mean, Doug, he might not describe himself as a shaman, but you rarely meet somebody more shamanistic than Doug. The thing is, and that event early in his life, I think he was late teens, early 20s when that happened to him. And there is a movie about it, if anybody's interested. It's called Survive the Savage Sea, starring Robert Ulrich. That happened to Doug for real. The thing is that those sort of very, like you say, very traumatic events, but it's not so much traumatic, it's also a very close to nature raw event.
Yes.
It's part of that guchach. It hangs with you, and you can see in Doug's life it's hung with him and turned him into this incredibly rich, cool, I don't mean rich financially, I just meant rich in terms of character, cool person that he is.
Colourful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also given him a certain amount, he wouldn't describe it as this, it's given him a certain amount of shamanic ability. For instance, with his Tai Chi, he does these wonderful tiny little movements that have massive effects on people. And if you watch him doing his form, you can hardly see him moving, it's a really, really cool thing. But yeah, you don't know, you could never say because it's a complex, holistic thing, but I suspect that event in his life made a pattern within him that gave rise to the weird and wonderful things that he's gone on to do with the rest of his life since that time, and that is how shamans work. Shamans are seeking that. They're seeking that input from nature, that constant guidance from the natural world, and putting themselves deliberately. I know Doug didn't deliberately put himself in to that extent in harm's way, although they had decided to sail around the world, which is quite a big thing for anybody to decide to do. But I don't think they expected to be sunk by a killer whale in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No. That probably wasn't on the itinerary. So yeah, but shamans are seeking those sort of experiences in a controlled way to a certain extent, because obviously you don't want to die. But on the other hand, if you don't make it raw enough that nature can teach you directly, then you're going to run the imagination trap risk. And I've seen this so many times, and in myself included in my early days in shamanism. The imagination trap thing is if you buffer yourself from nature, you can start imagining anything. Because we do, and that's one of the reasons why we've been successful, this incredible visualization, imagination ability that for whatever reason we have in abundance as a species. Well, we do know what the reason is, it's tool making. But which most other animals don't do, although some of them do. Just not. You could say definitely orangutans don't do it as well as we do, although they do on occasion go spearfishing. There's
a thought that certain primates are entering into the Stone Age era.
I think they've been there forever. Did they ever leave it? That's a question. They use tools. Chimpanzees use tools. So the question is, what in nature can we learn from in a relatively safe way? I mean, some places you go into the woods, you need to be careful about bears and stuff like that, but in general, and snakes and all that kind of thing. But in general, people who are familiar with the woods and the places where they are, and if you live in England's green and pleasant land, you are laughing, absolutely laughing. Because, I mean, we do have some dangerous animals, but they are, for instance, adders, snakes, they are terrified of you, absolutely terrified. They're not like black mambas or anything, So really, it's
keep a distance.
Very safe. It's very safe. Yeah. And most of the plants won't kill you unless you actually eat them. So it's a wonderful environment to be doing this kind of practice in, where there's no other concerns, there's no self-preservation concerns. You could just bathe in that. You can lie down, you can roll around on the forest floor, as I've done many times. And it's just wonderful that that atmosphere is there, and it's there all the time, right? It never goes away. Sometimes it's more than others. Different times a year. Sometimes in the spring, there's quite a lot of this kind of stuff going on, But and sometimes, but in the middle of winter, for instance, I'm going up the Black Wood at Rannoch Moor in the middle of winter. Still going on in there, that ancient forest. The only one in the UK, incidentally, like completely unspoilt. The atmosphere and the language of the trees is in there, but the next step. So we talked about the general effect on the promotional effect on Chalisti, and the fact that it tends to have a calming effect in a spiritual sense, and also in a physical sense on the body, reduction of inflammation, anti-tumorigenic activity of the terpenes. This type of stuff is getting documented in the literature, and so you can see it has a general sorting things out effect on you. But then beyond that, the next question is, can this language of the trees, they communicate in chemical terms, can it bridge the gap to the neurological systems, the way that we tend to deal with language, which is through the nervous system, neurons? Can it bridge that gap? And again, very recently, there have been studies that have shown that this is, intuitively, yes, it can, because that's how we experience the world as shamans, and the trees speak to us. And if we're not being delusional about stuff, then we have the experiential verification that we can understand this language, and that's got to be neuronal in the sense of us, because the kind of animals that we are, it's got to be. But in the scientific studies, some of these things have been shown to have neurological effects and even neuroprotective functionings. Beta caryophyllene, which is another terpene, has been shown to have a function of regulating neuronal receptors, and shows a range of activities, including neuroprotection. That's the protection of neurons in the body, in the bodies of animals. And so here's the trees. They're sending out these words into the atmosphere. Animals are taking them in by breathing or through the skin or whatever. And those chemicals are protecting those animals. And in natural environment, those would be the animals of the forest. The animals that keep the fertility cycles going within the forest. And again, it's like this Gaia idea. This idea of the forest is it's like a whole, you think the forest is a whole animal, one organism. And the actual animals and insects and plants and fungi and everything that make it up, the birds and what have you, they're all like, it's bloodstream and its nervous system and its lungs and its heart. And you follow what I mean? They holistically make up this one organism, which is the forest. And therefore, it's in the tree's interests to have this protective effect of their wonderful, powerful language upon the animal life in there. And if you're a shaman, you're part of that place. I've said that so many times on this podcast, haven't I? Just feel like you're part of that place, or be part of that place. Like you're no different from the trees and the ground. You're one of the things that the trees are offering their wonderful protection to. And these things have actually been shown in some studies to have antioxidant effects on, for instance, chasing down free radicals in the body, which are often the things that damage cells. And they have also been shown to have positive effects on some diseases like Parkinson's and these type of diseases. Inhibitory effects on progression. Nobody's saying it's curing these conditions, just to be clear, but they have shown neuroprotective functions in also Alzheimer's is another one. And so, and
It's
these
probably
again,
a case of just continued exposure. Like if you just go
And-
into a forest once a year, that's
and this-
one thing. If you live near a forest or
Yeah.
you're a hunter-gatherer who's just in the forest all the time, then that's another, isn't it?
And who knows? Because these things are so, and so generally neurodegenerative diseases have been shown to be reduced by lots of different types of terpenes. Their aggressiveness has been reduced by different types of terpenes. So the going back to the original question is, why don't I have wrinkles at this age, which maybe I should have? I don't know. Maybe it's just genetic. Maybe it's I'm going to get them soon. But I just thought in the back of my head the other day when I was discussing this with a friend, I just thought, is it because I've spent my life covered in terpenes? Covered head to foot in the language of the forest? Because I'm out there wherever I go, I'm always looking for trees, Even if I'm in London, I look at trees and stuff in London, and could that have something to do with it? Who knows? I don't know. But it's an interesting thing to think about. But another thing is, that's thinking about it into scientific terms, and it's very early days for this, but there has been a lot of research done on it. The next, so just to run through a few of them, just for interest, really. Monocyneal, which is a terpene, has been shown to have effects of antioxidation and neuroprotection. Octanol, anti-inflammation. Borneol, anti-inflammation, antioxidation, neuroprotection. And borneol acetate, another one, is anti-inflammation. Thiamine, anti-inflammation, anti-cancer, neuroprotection. Limonene, anti-inflammation, antioxidation, anti-cancer. Myrcene, anti-inflammation, anti-cancer. Perylyl alcohol, which is another one of these, anti-cancer. Pinene, anti-inflammation, anti-cancer, antioxidation, and neuroprotection. Pinene sounds like a cool one. Give me a glass of that stuff. Saponine, anti-inflammation. Terpenine.
No doubt it'll be bottled up into a pill at some point, Damon, and sold for millions and billions.
Terpenine, anti-inflammation, and caryophyllene, anti-inflammation, anti-cancer, antioxidation, neuroprotection. So there's a whole bunch of different terpenes that have been shown relatively recently in the scientific literature to a great extent. Remember, there's also the question of the extent of these things. But clearly, and also where the scientific interest is directed, you can see it's directed in a medical sense because, surprise, surprise, that's where all the money goes into chemistry, is from pharmacology, isn't it? It's from the pharmaceutical industry. So obviously they're the areas they're looking into. They're not actually looking into other applications of these things in the human body. Like, for instance, the promotion of chelicity. I'll bet that one hasn't been investigated, But there's a great list of different terpenes that have been shown to a greater or lesser extent to have very positive effects on human beings. And so next point is it's free. So call to action for all followers of the Woven Energy podcast: get out into the woods, get yourself bathing in these terpenes, and just see what effects they have on you. The one thing that I would say is that the idea of them speaking to you as a language, remember, they speak to clouds. There's no reason why you shouldn't pick up on, learn the language that they're teaching you, and then see what effect it has on you. Like how we learn anything in shamanism, it's not a baseline thing. It's not a baseline activity. It's an activity in which we go into a shamanistic state, we experience energy changes, and then following the technique, we have impressions of those changes. We sort of know what the answer is without really being able to put it into words, and without really being able to articulate it, and without sometimes even being to remember how we came to that answer. As long as our shamanism is directed, then we can come to that answer. And a big part of coming to that answer, for me, in my life, has been this language of the trees, language of the plants. Yeah, I don't want to make out that trees are the only plants giving this off. Just language of the trees sounds cool, and trees are big and they give off a lot of this stuff, but there's other plants involved, right? So So that was my idea for the subject of this episode. And I just wanted to show that shamans saying this stuff for thousands of years, shamanism is not all made up in people's heads. It may be that they've only started looking into this stuff recently, but already they've found a ton of stuff. Now, if you'd gone back 100 years and somebody had said, oh, the trees are talking to the clouds and stuff, people would have laughed at you probably. But going back 50 years or maybe even 20, but they are, and it's been shown, and they're talking to us as well. And what our job is as shamans is to learn their language that they're very kindly offering to us, because it's an active language. It's not a passive language. It's not just information that's encoded in it. It has physiological effects on us and neurological effects on us. And so it's our blessing to be provided that wonderful gift by nature, part of what Mickey would have called the jikimotsu, the heavenly dew, the dew that comes to you, for the knowledge that comes to you from nature. It's not just words, it has active effects. And, those active effects, what are their energy changes? All those things we've talked about on this one, in terms of the effects of the different terpenes, for instance, on the human body, their energy changes. And that's what we study as shamans. We study the energy changes that go on in nature. And actually, terpenes are loud ones. You get in a forest, the terpenes are loud in there. There's loads of other subtle energy changes going on there, but the terpenes are loud. A great place to start learning. I mean, the language of the trees. A great place to start learning. And so I hope that wasn't too woo-woo for you, Joe.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Because I can talk about hugging trees. I can talk about hugging trees if you want, because I do that a lot. As people want to test.
Main takeaway, chillicity, go practice chillicity. Or just, number one, get yourself into some woodland if possible. Number two, practice your chillicity. Number three, practice your stages of shamanism and shamanic technique in wooded area. See what you can pick up on.
Yes, indeed.
Brilliant. Should we leave it there?
Yes, let's do that, mate. Thanks to everybody for listening. Shout out again to the patrons. You guys are awesome. And shout out to Doug. We've used you as the subject of one of the subjects of this episode, so love you, man.
Yeah. And you can, if you want to support us on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/wovenenergy. But as always, thanks for listening, and we will see you in the next one. Cheers.